Hello and welcome. It's been quite a week, hasn't it? Not just in football either, but in the world in general. And mostly, I haven't even felt like thinking or talking about football or even watching football very much, to be fair. But here we are now, and life must go on.
You are listening to PSG Review. Here's your host, Mikko.
Chances are that the history books won't remember the week when PSG played against Atletico Madrid and Angers from either one of these matches, and there are things that are far bigger than football. We received really bad news for the climate change, human rights, women's rights, and general peace on earth, but such is democracy. These are all values that are very dear and important to me. And I'm allowed to have my opinion on elections even if I don't have a vote in them. Some elections just are globally more significant than others. I'd love nothing more than to be unbothered by the mess of other nations, but sometimes there's no such luxury. I would also like to send my condolences, whatever they are worth, to the member of the PSG coaching staff, Rafael Pol, and his family, as the sad news were that his wife Raquel had passed away before the Angers match. There are no words big enough for a moment like this. I must say that this midweek I wasn't in the mood for football at all, and I won't really get into the details of that match against Atletico Madrid. That is yesterday's news already, but we will have a close inspection in this episode of what, and even more so, how serious are our Champions League challenges. Let's do a quick recap of PSG Angers from Saturday night, that is yesterday, as I record this on Sunday, and it was an interesting prospect, this match, because 1 week before, Angers had beaten AS Monaco in the Principality, and earlier this season they drew against Marseille also, back when they were still performing. So by no means a pushover team in Ligue 1 this autumn. It was thanks to them that we actually had a little bit of a wiggle room on top of the table, because they had been taking points from those other clubs that are there in the mix underneath us on the Ligue 1 table. There was some rotation on the match. Nuno Mendes, João Neves, William Pacho, Vitinha and Dembele were all resting on the bench when the match started. They were out from the usual starters. Instead, they were Milan Skriniar, Lucas Peraldo, Seni Mayulu, Fabian Ruiz and Lee Kang-in on the pitch. Otherwise, pretty usual lineup. I mean, that is quite few exceptions to it, but the rest were more or less as they have been this season. Any threat that Angers could have posed, well, it wasn't forthcoming, certainly not in the first half, and Lee Kang-in started by scoring 2 goals, and after him, before halftime, Bradley Barcola scored 2 goals also, so it was 0-4 halftime numbers, and Angers was having a bit of a nightmare. It wasn't going even close to the way that they had wanted, and the fact that PSG was playing very well made them look even worse, of course. The ball was moving very well for PSG and the goals were coming. A little later we shall discuss some of our continental challenges, but scoring was not a challenge in the first half on the night in this medieval city in the western part of France. Well, then the second half started with PSG bringing in Desiree Doué and Yorem Shag, while Barcola was given some rest, so no hat-trick for him, and also Hakimi came to bench, and Angevins, as the inhabitants of Angers are known, on their side started the second half by throwing a bunch of tennis balls on the pitch. That mess took quite a moment to clear, but PSG in their pink uniforms continued the dominance, and there was frustration not just in the stands but among the home team players as well. In all fairness, PSG wasn't 100% clinical by any means in all of its actions. There were surprisingly many sloppy passes and losing possession. At the first half, at some point, I counted at least 4 pretty bad passes by Hakimi, who has been having such a great season this season, but those passes could have been costly, and Ruiz was also struggling a few times that could have ended up in the wrong goal. Pretty good rotation all in all, that has to be said. Colomwani and Dembele as well as Neves came in during the second half, and that concluded all the 5 substitutions for this match. PSG had the opportunity to score a few more goals at least on the second half. And we're even quite unlucky not to succeed in that. But more than that, in the dying moments of the match, the team conceded 2 quite quick goals. Pretty good goals by Angers. I have to say the first one certainly was, not so much the second one, but this is the type of thing that is also very costly against Atletico Madrid. Pretty much the same kind of thing, like last-minute goals. These last-minute goals, they should not become a new habit, because it's a terrible habit to have just before the final whistle. And because of that, a lot of carefulness is needed, a lot of focus until the referee ends the match. There's no escaping that, as the final result of the match in the end was 2 goals for Angers and 4 for our Paris Saint-Germain. In the Ligue 1, the season is going really well. That much is true. Only with Thomas Tuchel, we have had more points after this many matches, and we are, after all, unbeaten domestically thus far. We're comfortably, very comfortably on top of the Ligue 1 table, but on the continent, while we have played very similarly, the results are quite the contrary. So what is actually the challenge that PSG as a club, as a project that it currently is facing right now in the Champions League? Well, I feel like the analysis actually isn't too complex, quite frankly, because the team plays pretty decent football for the most part and is absolutely in the mix of top European clubs in terms of creating chances, the XPs and such. And this is kind of where the limitations of the spreadsheet guys start becoming evident, because the chances aren't same thing as goals. But admittedly, of course, they often indicate what we can realistically expect from the team. The more chances, and especially good chances there are, you expect that more goals also will come, all things being equal. But of course, our issue has been as simple and as old as football itself. If you can't score goals and if you can't stop the opponents from scoring them, there's a little else that matters, because the matches are won by actual goals and not by expected goals. And since really the last spring semi-finals against Dortmund, we have been hitting the goalpost from every imaginable angle. So many golden chances and so few goals to show for it. Like literally, there have been not very many goals since those Dortmund matches. There were no goals against Dortmund in 2 matches. There was 1 goal against Girona, that was an own goal. There was no goals against Arsenal. Then there was the match against PSV, and now there was 1 goal against Atletico Madrid. There really have not been very many goals for this many matches. But the point that I'm making is that this issue we have right now, it predates this campaign. It started before this season. If you can't score and you concede, you can't really win. Okay, that's the platitudes done now. These are the things that are so obvious and evident that they don't really even need to be said. But basically, I guess the most interesting and important question right now is that, well, why can't we score? Why don't we score? Or the team, why doesn't the team not score more from these opportunities, good opportunities, and whose fault is that? Well, for this too, I think the explanation is fairly simple. Certainly one option for the explanation. I mean, there are more complex things behind it, undoubtedly, but basically 2 things collided this early season, and those are somewhat optimistic recruitment in the summer and the worst possible injury we could have had after only 20 minutes of football this season in the very first competitive match of the season. Basically, PSG's depth is a real issue this season, more so than it has been in the previous seasons. We could have been in a different trouble this time around if the injury that Gonzalo Ramos suffered would have happened to, let's say, to Nuno Mendes or Achraf Hakimi, or if it happened to Marquinhos. Because these 2 are positions where there's very little depth. And yes, you can say, of course, we have Lucas Peraldo, who's a good centre-back. He's not an amazing left-back, and then we have young Jorem Zag. He can be used, but he might not be on a required level in a more demanding matches, especially in Europe. And after that, we're talking about Warren Zaire-Emery out of position. I mean, this applies mainly to Hakimi's right back position. And when Zaire-Emery is there, we run out of depth in the midfield then. So it impacts other areas of the pitch as well. And on the wings, arguably, we have few options. And in attacking play, there are players. Are all of them on a required level right now? Well, no, but there are a few options there. But what we don't have in the absence of Gonzalo Ramos is players who can put the balls in efficiently as a striker, as a target player. should the injury have been to someone else, we could possibly at least have an entirely different problem and a conversation that we would try to address here. So if we have all these chances, as we have had in Europe this season, I imagine Gonzalo Ramos should be able to convert quite a few of those, but there's no backup striker in this team. There's no second option behind him. There are only these false nine solutions and players like Marco Asensio, who with all the love and compassion cannot be the player we rely on. I know he was solid against Angers, but that really can't be the measure of him. And I don't know what his salary is exactly, but since he came on a free transfer, my guess is that he makes more than perhaps he should. And if we could change him, we could probably find more useful player profile for less money. And then there's Lee Kang-in, also great match in Ligue 1 again, and he's a good player. He's a very good player, some sort of multi-purpose player in attack, but not a striker. And then there's Colomwani, who is not, and this has been well established by now, not a striker either. He just isn't a striker. So there is no backup target player. And in that sense, the injury that had to take place was perhaps the one that we were least prepared for. And whose fault is that then? In football, and I guess quite often in life in general, we seem to need someone to point the finger at and condemn. And of course, we have a few people, various degrees, in charge of our recruitment, and the main man is, of course, Luis Campos, the sporting director, whatever his current title is now, but essentially that is his role. That is his remit, but of course we all know that even if he would have taken a step back, the club president Nasser Khelaifi is never too far from these conversations. And of course the coach Luis Enrique has also been consulted, at least reportedly, more than most coaches before. They say that he has had a big say in all of these transfers and players and so on and so forth. The mitigating circumstance, not to overlook, is that there's been very much a financial uncertainty with the departure of Kylian Mbappe and his contested bonuses that are still being talked about in courts and various meeting rooms. It's difficult for me to know what impact that has had in the availability of the financial fair play funds. To what extent the uncertainty impacted the summer business. Sometimes people pick quotes from Enrique or anyone else involved, what they might have said in the process, but of course what they say is external communication. It's optics, it's PR, it's perception management, and they aren't actually necessarily going to tell us precisely what the truth is in its entirety. Of course they won't. So I don't take all of those quotes by their face value, and probably you should neither. And what many seem to forget also, and I think this is an important point, is that Gonzalo Ramos came to Paris as probably the most exciting striker in European football who was available at the time. His career has been sort of bizarrely overshadowed by two of the biggest names in the world football. I mean, what I don't mean necessarily the biggest, but certainly two names that are among the handful of biggest names in the world of football. In his national team, of course, Portugal, his playing time has been very much limited because of certain Cristiano Ronaldo and his first season in Paris. That was last season. He was behind Kylian Mbappe. Even if they were playing at the same time, of course, what happened is that Ramos was not the target player. I mean, we've been analyzing this many times in this show, PSG Review. The passes were not primarily coming to Gonzalo Ramos last season if he was sharing the duties with Kylian Mbappe on the pitch. And that is something that was just the case, but his numbers were very solid despite the lack of consistent playing time when he was not sharing the pitch with our former number 7. So he had challenges like lack of consistent playing time, that the role as a target player wasn't really always actually, happening as such. And then he also, of course, 1 year ago had a difficult virus infection. He lost a lot of weight and he went through that. It took some time for him to recover. So whatever happened last season is not necessarily a good reflection of what he can deliver us hopefully this season. So I say all these things to say that actually Gonzalo Ramos is a very good striker. And we can forget that when we are frustrated with the lack of goals or his injury or whatever. But in actual fact, he is a very good striker. That's certainly my analysis of it. I mean, it's hardly controversial. His scoring instincts are very strong, of course. And at best, he reminds you of sort of prime Cavani in the box. Very strong, instinct there to score, and he can do that with his feet, both of them, and head alike. Ramos initially came to Paris on loan, but that was made into permanent deal pretty soon for reported 65 million euros. So he is not supposed to be a lightweight at all. It's not just my word. I mean, usually the money is kind of showing you some kind of indication of what we are dealing with. There were names mentioned last summer like Victor Osimhen, and right now having someone like him would of course be amazing. But if we would have paid 100 million plus euros for him, Ramos would have remained a very expensive bench player, and we already have Randal Colomwani, let's face it, who of course was even more expensive, but we sort of can't have an endless supply of these types of players in this kind of price bracket. So for me, the last thing I problematize is not having spent that much money, as Victor Osimhen, for instance, would have required to get a starter. What we should have arguably done is to have a solid backup option. Now, I had this hunch last summer. During the Olympics, I was watching them, and so was Nasser Al-Khelaifi. He was, of course, at the stadium, and I saw him after one match talking with the top scorer from Morocco team, Sofiane Rahimi. It was after one of those matches, and I thought to myself that there could be a good understudy for Ramos, that kind of player that we could use. Now, I will be the absolute first person to admit that one of my personal weaknesses, to a very bizarre level, one that I can't even explain to you in its full effect, it's almost like a reverse superpower, is that I cannot for the life of me estimate and guess people's ages. Like nobody, if I see a person, I have no idea how old or young they are. To me, everyone is plus minus 10 years in that range, and it has happened that my guess hasn't even landed on that somewhat large sector. So in that spirit, I thought that Rahimi would have been a very young player. I think he does have a very youthful look, on top of which, of course, in the Olympics, it's fairly safe bet that most players are young. But he actually is already 28 years old. Nevertheless, very good in the Olympics. He scored 8 goals in 6 matches. Now, Olympics, of course, Olympics, it's hardly the World Cup, we know that, but it's still an impressive number, and he would have been an affordable player who could have been very useful right now. And it's just a one name, it's just a thought that I had last summer, and I thought that maybe it's going to happen because I saw him chatting there with our club president, Nasser Al-Khelaifi. When I was watching the Olympics, this is what I genuinely thought, because I think it would be good to have competition, but I also think that Ramos deserves a chance to be the world-class scorer that I think he has every opportunity to be once he gets his proper chance. And with the creation of opportunities that seems consistent with this team, I feel like he could get a decent number of goals this season. Even if he has missed 3 months of it, I think he could still get quite a few goals. Once he gets ready to play again, and this could be quite soon actually. It could be as soon as in the next match, which at least technically could mean that he would be traveling to the next Champions League match to Germany to play against Bayern Munich. Nothing in life is guaranteed, and least of all PSG players coming back from injury in time, but he could be getting back imminently. And then we will see what form and how long it takes for him to become that guy. Or is he able to become that guy? But I still stand firmly behind my stance that I had also last summer. He deserves to have a full chance to be our number one striker. Competition is important for every position, certainly for forwards, but there are different ways to approach it, I feel. Having a player like Osimhen comes with a certain price, and not just a transfer fee, of course, and salaries on top of that, but there's an expectation and media pressure which we have just managed to move on from. We have just this summer finally managed to chew our leg from that bear trap of the type of media magnifying class. I don't know if you have noticed, but this season there's been far fewer scandals and headlines around the club. There's no prize for guessing the reason why that is. A great example of the type of player we could have potentially used right now is the one we used to have. A player so good he needed 4 names. Eric Maxim Choupo-Moting. Now, Choupo-Moting in the end proved that he actually had the ability to be a very good player, and evidence of that is that directly from the Champions League final losing team, which was us, PSG, in 2022, he upgraded to the only team above us in that competition, Bayern Munich. The reason why I mention him is that he knew his position in the squad. Not just, that he's a striker, he's a forward, whatever. He knew where he was in the pecking order, and he was not problematizing it. He knew that he was not a starter, but every time he got an opportunity, he did what he could. Was what he could do always the same as Mbappe or Neymar or whatever? Not necessarily, but he did what he could, and he wasn't complaining. Certainly it came across like that. I certainly never heard any reports that there would have been any drama around him. And great work ethic on top of that, the willingness to support the collective, that is very important. And that type of player is a great player to have. Another one of those, of course, in another part of the pitch was Danilo. These players are very valuable for the cohesion of the whole squad. So basically we could say that the miscalculation PSG has made, and for which we are paying the price for now in Champions League, is not, in my opinion, not having hired a world-class striker, because there's a chance we already have one in Ramos. And you may disagree with that, that's perfectly fine, you may disagree with that, but that's basically the premise that I start this analysis from. But a solid argument can be made to support that. A solid argument could be made that Ramos could be that guy. So it's either you believe in that or you don't believe in that. And the 3 months that he has missed, we are starting to be at the end of it, but it's not the end of the world. If he can play consistently for the rest of the season, it will look less significant. Those 3 months, and the real concern is actually rather that can he really play? Is he just one of those injury-prone players? Can he play for the rest of the season pretty consistently? I hope he is not one of those injury-prone players, but it's not a conclusion anyway we should jump into right now because there's not enough evidence behind it. But of course, it's a concern. Last season he had some kind of virus that seems more like a freak accident, the kind of thing that just sort of comes to somebody has it, and so on and so forth. I guess there isn't really any evidence that I would kind of lean on to say that he's a player who is categorically someone who will miss sort of half of the season like Neymar or somebody like that. But there should have been another player who can play his position, because this whole false nine myth has not really delivered to us in any meaningful way. Certainly not in the Champions League. Like I said, in Ligue 1 it sometimes can work quite well, but in Champions League, yeah, the evidence is very scarce. Now, currently, there are some reports online, and this is very predictable, that Victor Gyökeres would be linked to PSG, and undoubtedly he will be linked to every top club in Europe. I don't think there's any doubt around that. Would I like to have him? Well, yes, because he could be that generational talent, even better than Ramos. What do I know? Will Ramos even ever deliver? Should Gyökeres continue to delivering? I mean, it's all a chance that we're taking. I don't have the answers for these things, but I think Ramos will be fine, and I think Gyökeres will also be a great player. Whoever has him is going to be a very lucky team, but am I thinking that PSG is getting ready to sign the next Swedish striker to follow Zlatan? Well, I think it's a massively long shot with so much competition, so it's certainly too early to even have an emotional response to that, let alone intellectual opinion. It could go either way anyway. Would Gyökeres want to come to Ligue 1? Perhaps he would. Who knows? Maybe he would like to follow Zlatan, but he will be very sought after player. And I feel like the more urgent thing for us is to have solid depth in all positions rather than a singular superstar in one position, or even necessarily on all positions. We have tried that enough times, and the results, we know the results, right? We know the results. We know what has happened with that before. And the issue is that you can't choose who gets injured. That's the problem. Or suspended at an inconvenient time, for that matter. This time it was Gonzalo Ramos, but obviously, like I said, it could have been anybody else. And right now we're also paying the price for the injury of Lucas Hernandez, who could provide much needed rotation for our backline. When he's going to be back, I think that's going to be a huge help for PSG's defense. But if Ramos had stayed available, we would talk about something else. Perhaps we would have scored a few goals that could have helped us to beat PSV and Atletico Madrid in the Champions League, because that is our trouble. The Champions League and the margins are minuscule in what would have made it essentially a very good campaign. That's the thing. As bad as our European campaign looks on paper right now, it's so close to being a very good one. So close. Like, so close. If Nuno Mendes would have been injured on the match day one instead, we would have a whole different conversation right now. We would be talking about some other player that we should have been hiring instead of him. Maybe Theo Hernandez, we would be like, oh, why didn't we not hire Theo Hernandez and not talk anything about Victor Osimhen? Because in that case, that would be the player that we would have rather needed. I'm not saying that he would have been on his way anyway, but nevertheless, you get my point. We would be asking, why was there no reasonable backup to whoever player is unavailable, and right now it just happens to be Gonzalo Ramos. Whether it was Nuno Hakimi or whoever else it would have been, the question that we have is that we need more depth in general than rather highlighting retrospectively the one position where the injury did occur. No one could have known that in advance. We need to be prepared for any eventuality rather than to pinpoint specific issues with the benefit of the hindsight. Of course, we now know which player would have been great addition, but we could not have known that 1 minute before Gonzalo Ramos got injured. What we could have known, like I said, and I'm not backtracking on that, is that there should have been a backup for him, but not necessarily somebody like Victor Osimhen. Like, I think that there could have been an understudy, there could have been a backup, and we need that in all positions. And I think that striker was a kind of one where it was left on these false nine ideas, plans, whatever they might have been. I will finish this thought by saying that there was the same reason why I wasn't so keen on Victor Osimhen, who I like, very much. I think he's an amazing player, really great player, but why I didn't want him to come to PSG last summer, despite him being league untested world-class player, is why I wasn't too keen on Jadon Sancho or Kvicha Kvaratskhelia. Amazing players at their best, but just I felt like the same thing as Ramos, who, in my opinion, deserved a shot to show us what he has as a striker. So did Bradley Barcola deserve the same chance. Some people online are a little bit salty about him since Atletico match. It wasn't the best, but he has had a very good season, and he's a player who could become a really great player. He has a great mentality and attitude, and that counts for a lot. He works very hard and keeps his head down. I feel the same way about Ramos, by the way, and the issue with getting 100 million euro competitors for these young guys is that they don't get to develop in peace. They will get some random minutes. Then Bradley Barcola would get the same minutes as Desiree Doué, and Desiree Doué, maybe he would not have been hired in that case. They won't get the same consistent playing time, and once more we stack our squad with unbenchables just when we have rid ourselves from this very issue. The player we can and probably should have a conversation about is Gianluigi Donnarumma, and here I feel like we could have done better. Well, it's an old football wisdom that while competition and depth is needed in all positions, I've been just talking about that doesn't necessarily apply in the same way, certainly, with goalkeepers. We know how it was with Kevin Trapp and Alphonse Areola taking turns. It wasn't really working for either one of them. Then Buffon was coming into the mix at some points. Then we had Navas and Donnarumma at the same time. It doesn't work very well. It's just a position where we need a great starter who gets to start, and then the decent backup who is ever ready but not too unhappy with the backup slot. That's an important role, to have a player who is happy to play that role also. And there's been complaints about Donnarumma before, and we know his strengths and we know his weaknesses. We know he's a great shot stopper, one of the best, but far from a world class when it comes to delivering the ball, passing it around, distributing and opening the game from his end. We know that this is not his strength, and we also know that in the world of Luis Enrique football, this is a little bit of a hindrance within the system, to say the least. It's a mismatch, but it's something that we always knew before, even it started happening. We knew when PSG hired Donnarumma, which of course coincided with his heroics in the European Championships when he was playing a key role, winning Italy the trophy in 2021, even if the official year, of course, of that tournament is 2020, but for corona reasons, it was played in 2021. When he joined us, he was awarded as the best goalkeeper in the world, and he really had these amazing Euros behind him. But he was hired to PSG not because of his holistic abilities. Of course, it was already known what his weaknesses were, and then when Luis Enrique was hired later, we knew that they would be a bit of a mismatch, like said. But all this was seen as not a big enough problem to change the course of events, which of course PSG could have made different types of choices along the way. And some people now say that when has Donnarumma ever performed well under pressure? which is a very funny thing to say. Well, I mean, one final of the Euros comes to mind at the Wembley when there was not just the whole English team, but their somewhat rowdy fan base filling the stadium against him, a fan base that went on to trash the place up. So clearly he has that in him to play under pressure, but somehow it has not worked as well in Paris, or rather for Paris. The rumors are, the negotiations are ongoing to extend his contract, but this is a real moment of truth for PSG. Do we continue to count on him and offer him a deal, perhaps more money than before? I don't know the details, or will the club say, thanks for these years, but we need to look into someone else who is more suitable for our current system? Someone like perhaps Lucas Chevalier from Lille, I would not mind. But of course, there's a very, very, very long queue for his agent as well, I think. But we have recruited last summer, of course, a goalkeeper, and that is a backup keeper, Matvei Safonov. He comes from Krasnodar and the Russian national team, which is ousted from the European football because of the war crimes of that country, as they should have been, and there is another country hopefully with the same determination to come as soon as possible. But Safonov wasn't really a sought-after keeper by European top clubs, and he hasn't really played very tough matches in his life, not on this kind of level. And nothing he has done in Paris suggests to me that he's a player of such ambitious level that is needed in Paris, because the rumors keep on suggesting that he isn't simply a backup keeper, but somehow competing for a starting spot against Donnarumma. I don't know, it makes no sense to me. The rumor was that his recruitment was in order to buy a favor with Kvaratskhelia agent last summer, but whether that is true or not, I don't know. But I also don't get this whole thing very much at all. I'm not as against this Donnarumma as many people are. Am I happy with his level recently in our big matches? Well, no, not really. But at the same time, everyone will have more difficult patches in their career. Question is how long they will take, and how do you get up? How long does it take for in this whole process? What kind of player are you going to be? What can we look forward to? Yes, of course, it would be lovely to have the Donnarumma of the Euro 2020 finals, but it's not as simple as that. So if the club decides to say that's that and not renew and go for someone who has the level, who has the ability to play within the system, then I'm okay with that. It's just that the club needs to make this choice, and this will be a huge choice, far bigger than most individual players. The goalkeeper question is quite different. As far as our backup keepers go, I'm not quite sure I even fully get the idea behind the recruitment. In general, before the current one I already mentioned, we have Arnaud Tenas. He's now our third keeper. He was recruited just last season. He won the Olympic gold last summer, and then he was demoted immediately to be our third choice. His first touch is so smooth that if Kolomuani had it, he could not stop scoring goals, but he is a few centimeters shorter than his competition. It's not like he came to the job interview with the high heels on, I'm sure. Why was he hired if there was no plan, or did the plans change? If it is about his height, it makes little sense outside of the general chaos that is professional football. I mean, they knew how tall he was before he was recruited. That was not a secret. He wasn't lying about that. And then we have had before these similar kind of situations. Undeniable talent like Marcin Bulka. Some years ago he came to Paris, far from being started. He was so far from being started in Paris because of the names we had at the time, and he was a young man, but now he's doing very well for Nice. And he could also take a step into a much bigger team. So why was he ever gotten from Chelsea to come to Paris? Like, what was the point of that if there was really not a plan for him to take a step up? I don't quite see the reason, but of course I'm hardly in the inner circles where these choices and decisions are made and understood. Also, fair to say that these choices have not all been made by same people. Coaches and sporting directors have changed since, but of course the club president is the same. I don't know how involved he is in scouting backup keepers though. I don't know. I'm kind of doubtful of that. So what happens with the goalkeeper situation? I think we have to either keep Donnarumma or let him go. No half measures are needed. Either we believe in him as a long-term solution or we won't, and then we act accordingly. For backup, we should have either someone who is seasoned and towards the end of their career but can still deliver when needed. I mean, Sergio Rico wasn't exactly that before his injury and accident, terrible accident. I'm so happy that he can play football again, but he wasn't exactly this profile, but he is a kind of good example of that nevertheless. Or someone with a very high potential, but not someone who has the same strengths and the same weaknesses as our starter, only much weaker strengths and much worse weaknesses. That's not a good solution. That helps no one involved, but whatever choices are made, they will be future defining. Thank you very much for tuning in to PSG Review. We are not living in a perfect world. Far from it, but we must try to keep on pushing forward. PSG men will play Toulouse on Friday the 22nd of November after the international break, which has now started, and after that Bayern Munich on the road. By then, just about like I was talking earlier, we could have Gonzalo Ramos on the pitch. Only just. Could go either way, to be honest with you. And in the big picture, I do not wish for him to be rushed back one moment before he's absolutely ready to be reintroduced into the competitive football, no matter how urgently we need him, and we do need him very urgently. That is true. PSG women did beat Strasbourg earlier on Saturday during the afternoon at the training center in Poissy. That match ended 4-0 with Marie-Antoinette Katoto hat-trick and very first goal for our new Norwegian teenager, Froya Dorsen. Next, they will play against Reims Dijon and then the derby against Paris FC, but by that time we are already well into December. My name is Mikko. Thank you for listening to PSG Review, and more next time, but until then, peace.